Chinese medicine has been for me the fulfillment of a search for a congenial system of healing. It is a personal, subtle, gentle, yet highly technical medical system which allows me to be close to the essence, to the life force, both of my own and that of others. It's a masterpiece of harmony, intricacy, and movement, which never ceases to engage me, never ceases to fascinate me and intrigue me. How people change in relation to their socioeconomic development. That is depression versus anxiety. And I'm not sure why you asked this question, but it happens to be one of my favorite topics. And because, again, right after the war, I went back to college, had a very difficult time adjusting. Well, that's right, I have to keep my glasses on. And young people would get together and talk, and mainly what we shared with each other was our anxiety. Everybody was anxious. And, since that time, I mean, that was the sort of flowering of psychoanalysis, of forms of psychotherapy, counseling. All this stemmed from that time and to what it is today. And so people began to, at my age, be psychologically aware and talk about their feelings. And the main feeling that people shared was anxiety. People were anxious. Nobody was depressed. There was just no complaint. I cannot remember a person who ever looked depressed or sounded depressed or complained about being depressed. But they were all anxious. And it was a perfectly appropriate time to be anxious because as a result of the war, and you'd have to have done what I did to fly over Europe and see that there was nothing left to it. There was no country left in the world except the United States. Every other country had been devastated, all the way from China to France. If you walked through the country, you could see houses, but if you got above them, there was nothing in them. And this was all across Europe. There were millions of people wandering around Europe who had no food, no clothes, no place to go. The world was devastated. At least 70 million people had died in that period of time. So the United States was all that was left. And we had this prosperity. We were selling things we were giving them money, and then with that money that we gave them, they would buy our products, which is what made the United States so prosperous and why everybody had a job. And coming out of the Depression into this prosperity, really young people weren't sure how to handle this, how we were going to do this. We didn't even know that that was probably what it was. But basically, I would say up until sometime in the early 60s, the principal complaint was anxiety. Everybody went to see a psychoanalyst or somebody to get help with their anxiety. I was already working as a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. Nobody came to me with depression. They were all scared. And together with the anxiety, there was a great deal of optimism. There was no reason not to be, because we had everything. We had the whole world in our hands. And then the television came along, and then there was the beginning of the breakup of the family, which added more anxiety because kids were growing up rarely seeing their parents. The father was out making a lot of money, the mother was out spending it, and they were home watching television and having what was now beginning to appear in the supermarkets, ready-made meals. You just put it in the oven for a couple of minutes and you ate. So if you had brothers and sisters, usually you had a television of your own, or they had their friends, you had your friends. The family began to break up. And then in the 1960s, we encountered the flower generation. And this was a group of people, they were, a lot of them, I forget what you call that generation, but it's a generation in which there was a lot of kids. Baby boomers, yes. Yeah. And so at that particular time, I was already a practitioner, a professional, and I came to essentially be in charge of all the drug programs on the South Shore of Long Island, which was 150 miles, and worked for the state of New York. I also ran a child guidance center, and I began to work as a consultant and a psychiatrist, and eventually a professor at a college. And so I saw hundreds and hundreds of young people, all of whom were turning on and tuning out, and they were all on drugs. And why were they turning to drugs? Where was this anxiety that was in my generation, going from depression to war to prosperity? What was happening to them? Where were they going? And basically, as a result of what happened in the 1950s, they didn't seem to have any foundation. They were turning to drugs. If you ask them why were they taking drugs, they did not want to encounter any kind of stress. Stress for them meant having to deal with other people, having to encounter them in difficult ways. They didn't want to struggle. They couldn't deal with their anger. And they felt anonymous. They were told by their parents, me, though I didn't do that, of course, that when they came, or they were lost at the age of 11, 12 years, what do I do? How do you handle this? Their parents were telling them, and they were taking the barbiturates and the amphetamines and the alcohol. We believe in you. We believe you can handle these things. We know you're strong. Positive reinforcement. I guess they thought they were doing something good, but one after the other said that what they wanted was somebody who would tell them what to do so they could not do it, so they could fight, so they could have a real adolescence, so there could be a real struggle. They never had that struggle. They never developed that strength that you get from fighting with your parents. And and so marijuana, LSD, these things were fantastic because they didn't feel the anger. They loved everybody. And life is essentially all about struggle. I mean, the Buddha said that life is suffering, and he meant it. And anything you do to run away from suffering and not deal with it is not life. So that, in my opinion, was the beginning. Now, gradually, in the 1970s, and there were great plans when Johnson became president in the Great Society. In my profession, they emptied out all of the mental hospitals. You can still see these people on the streets. There was a plan for the Great Society for a whole, every community was to have a community mental health center, to be staffed by professionals so that everybody had a place to go with a hierarchy of services to be provided for people at all levels of whatever your mental health situation was. All of that money that was supposed to go into that went into the Vietnam War. So they emptied out all the hospitals and nobody had any place to go. The Vietnam War was the beginning of a realization that our government wasn't necessarily our friend. And then everything that followed with Nixon and Watergate and so on. And by this time, industry had begun to pull itself together. It got Reagan to represent them. And the first thing he did was to break up a union. If you remember, oh no, you probably don't remember, but at that time in 1980, the people who run airports were going out on strike for higher wages. Reagan became president. He fired them all and hired people at whatever wage he did. He broke their union, and then American people thought this was wonderful. They'd already been on drugs for 15 years, and all the other unions gone. So a working person has nobody to represent them. They've more and more turned to drugs. This year in Vermont, I don't know if you know anything about Vermont from Florida, Vermont has no major city. It's completely rural. It has a lot of small cities and lots of little towns. The governor of Vermont, in his state of state speech this year, discussed only one subject, and that subject was the increase in 750% of the incidence of heroin in the state of Vermont in the year 2013. 750% in this state that has no major city. So ask yourself about what's going on in the rest of this country. At any rate, people were not moving ahead. They were beginning to work for the same amount of money, more and more hours, and from anxiety. And anxiety is always a good thing, because anxiety means you're still alive. You still have hope. There's something happening that you have to deal with, that you're nervous about, but something's happening. This all began to shift to depression. You don't find that many drugs out there for anxiety anymore. There are a couple, but you find endless drugs out there, new one every 6 months for depression. Because the country has become depressed. There's nothing to be anxious about. Things are going from bad to worse. So that's what's happened from 1945. What year is this? 2000 and something. We have gone from hope, which is accompanied by anxiety, to no hope, which is accompanied by depression. And that's the answer to that question.